I didn't know anything about this, I apologize. On my 24th birthday, Victorio walked into the ballroom with his mistress on his arm. He raised his glass before the capos and smiled as if I were an old piece on his chessboard. Camille knows how to stand by my side without embarrassing me. 300 eyes waited for my collapse. I didn't give anyone that satisfaction. I slipped the 4-generation ring off my finger, placed it in her hand, and smiled. I told her to keep it all. The man, the name, the bed, and the shame. I walked out without looking back. On the front steps, Dante Valente was waiting for me. He was leaning against his car. He was the rival Don, the enemy. And his smile made me understand that my humiliation hadn't ended my story. It had opened the door to revenge. I woke up before the alarm. As always happened on days when I knew something would cost me dearly. The bedroom at Villa Belandi smelled like the same cold perfume as always. They were white lilies that a maid replaced every 3 days by my husband's express order. Victorio liked flowers that didn't smell like a living woman. I had already learned to read in the smallest things the size of the men who chose for me. And for 4 years I had been reading. I stretched my hand across the icy sheet on the other side of the bed. It was empty as on nearly every night. Victorio slept upstairs in the room he called his rest office. It had a double bed too large for a man who slept alone. I no longer asked. I had stopped asking in the 2nd year. I sat up slowly, 24 years old. I said the number in silence, someone testing a word in a foreign language. It didn't sound like mine. At 20, I had walked into Villa Belandi with a suitcase and a degree in art history from the University of Florence. The suitcase had disappeared in the first week, replaced by clothes chosen by Victorio's personal seamstress. The diploma had been hung in his office in a black frame, as if it were a hunting trophy. I remembered standing for 2 minutes in front of that frame the day he hung it. Victorio thought I was moved. I was understanding for the first time that he had framed the only thing I had brought of myself, and that there behind that glass was where I was also supposed to stay. I walked barefoot to the window. Milan was waking up gray with that low October light that seemed to apologize for existing. From up here I could see the road that ran down to the city, and beyond it, in some invisible point to the south, was Florence. It was the city where before I turned 20, I would wake up with dried paint under my fingernails and the smell of lime on my hands. Scaffolding, a fine brush, and a 15th century fresco asking for patience. I would ask for patience in return. The two of us managed it. Before 20, I had a teacher named Emma Colomo. She told me that the hand of a restorer is recognized by the way it touches a book before opening it. I still touched books that way. It was the only thing I had left. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and breathed. Today was my birthday. Victorio had announced 3 weeks before that he would throw a party. I had thanked him. I had smiled prettily the way he liked. I had chosen a black dress, long and closed up to the neck. Victorio thought a married woman shouldn't show her collarbone at a family party. I had agreed out loud. In silence I noted in the corner of my memory that Capo Salviati was diabetic, and that Capo Lobiano owed an obscene amount to the loan shark at the port. Small things, decorative things. I had an entire mosaic of decorative things stored in my head, and none of the men in that house knew. I put on a cream silk robe and went downstairs. The breakfast room at Villa Belandi was a hall larger than it needed to be with high ceilings. It had a crystal chandelier and a table far too long for 2 people. Victorio was already seated at the head. He had his newspaper open, black coffee, a charcoal gray suit, and no tie yet. 38 years looked on him like 10 more. He had the kind of face that aged in layers. A layer of power, another of weariness, another of impatience. At 20, I had mistaken the first layer for personality. "Good morning," I said, pausing at the door. He didn't look up from the newspaper, he just said, "Good morning, Alessia." I sat at the other end. The maid, Lucia, appeared with the pot and poured my coffee without quite looking at me. Lucia had learned early not to look at me directly. That was how you survived in that house. "Happy birthday," Victorio said, still without looking up. He said the party would be at the villa in Como tonight, and that he had already sent for my dress. I asked what dress. He said the one I chose. I lifted the cup to my lips so I wouldn't answer right away. The coffee was too hot. I swallowed anyway. I had learned to swallow hot things. In Como, I repeated calmly. I said I thought it would be here in Milan. He said he changed his mind. He turned the page. He said he had a surprise. That word in his mouth had never brought anything good. Surprise had been the name of the trip canceled on our 1st anniversary. It had been the name of the unannounced meeting that forced me to host 3 Sicilian capos for a whole week in our 2nd year. It had been the name of his absence at my 22nd birthday party. I had turned 24 today, and the word still made me shiver in a way I couldn't hide. I asked what kind of surprise without any tremor. Vittorio folded the newspaper slowly. He looked up for the first time. They were gray eyes without depth. The eyes of a man who decided things in other rooms. Alessia. His voice was patient, like someone speaking to a child. He said I just needed to smile prettily, and the rest was up to him. I smiled prettily. It was the oldest reflex I had. He returned to the newspaper. The conversation was over. I stayed 5 more minutes in front of the coffee so he wouldn't suspect any rush on my part. And when the clock chimed, I stood up without making any noise with the chair and crossed the hall. Before I reached the door, he spoke again without looking up. He told me to put on the right ring. Not that silver one I had been wearing, but the Bellandi one. I told him I always wear the Bellandi one whenever I remember to look. I left the hall without answering. In the corridor, I closed my hand over the chest of the robe and took 3 deep breaths. It wasn't anger. It was something older that ran deeper. It was the realization repeated for the 1000th time that the man with whom I had shared a house for 4 years didn't know the name of the silver ring I wore on my little finger. It was my mother's ring. It had been in that house the whole time. He had never seen it. I climbed the stairs and turned left toward the closet. The dress Vittorio had chosen was hanging on the central hanger. It was black silk, fitted, with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. The kind of dress that said I belonged to him. That I was an elegant backdrop for any scene he might want to paint that night. I put on the dress. I put on the jewelry he had ordered to be laid out. Pearl earrings, a white gold necklace, and the Bellandi engagement ring. It was 4 generations of dark blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. The ring weighed more than it looked. It had always weighed in the inner pocket that Vittorio had sewn into all formal dresses without noticing, thinking it was a seamstress detail. I tucked my father's pen inside. It was a black fountain pen with a worn gold band, the only thing I had asked to keep when he died. It was the only object in that house that was mine and only mine. I combed my hair into a low bun. I put on dark lipstick. I gave the pretty smile in the mirror just to make sure it still worked. It worked. I went down the stairs slowly. Vittorio was already standing in the hall with his back to me. He was in his party suit talking on the phone. When he heard me, he turned and looked me up and down. His eyes paused 3 seconds on the necklace. "Never on my face. Let's go," he said, hanging up the phone. He said we were almost late because of me. I didn't answer. I crossed the hall, crossed the wooden double doors that a guard opened without greeting me, and went down the 3 stone steps to the car. The driver waited for me with the back door open. I got in. Vittorio got in from the other side. The door closed with that armored sound I had learned to recognize in the first month of marriage. The sound of a vault closing. The car pulled out down the cypress-lined avenue heading toward Como. I looked out the window and thought with a calm that wasn't mine yet, but was arriving. Tonight I would swallow 1 more humiliation as I had swallowed the other 3. That was how you survived in that house. That was how you memorized 1 more password, 1 more route, 1 more name. That was how you made it to 25. I thought that I was wrong. The villa in Como glowed on the other side of the gate, as if the night had been commissioned by a set designer. I got out of the car with Vittorio's hand on my elbow. It was the exact pressure to look like chivalry to anyone watching. The exact force to remind me who was in charge. He had learned that touch in the first week of marriage. I had learned not to react to it in the second. Chandeliers lit behind every window. Expensive cars in the gravel parking lot. Capos in black jackets smoking near the entrance columns in small groups of 3, as they did at every Cosa Nostra dinner. I saw Capo Salviati in the second group near the fountain, Capo Lobiano in the third, Capo Tantino arriving behind me with a very tall blonde who wasn't his wife. I made a note. Smile. Vittorio whispered as we climbed the stone steps. I smiled. The main hall was a long rectangular space with double-height ceilings. There were Venetian mirrors on the 2 side walls, and glass doors open to the terrace over the lake. Round tables dressed in dark damask, low candles, and string quartet music in the background. Something by Vivaldi played too slowly to be beautiful. The smell of flowers and expensive tobacco. I recognized at least 50 faces. I also recognized the 3 discreet security cameras in the corners of the ceiling. Vittorio liked to film his own events, so he could later review who had greeted whom. He adjusted his cuff and said they were all going to start arriving. He told me to stay close to him. I replied that I always do. He looked at me for a second. He saw nothing because I had shown nothing. He turned his eyes back to the hall and said, "The surprise comes in half an hour." I started counting the time from that point on. I greeted people. I greeted Capo Salviati's wife, who smelled of gardenia and kissed me on both cheeks as always. I greeted 2 Sicilian cousins of Vittorio whom I saw once a year. I greeted the Monsignor who blessed the family's business in exchange for donations to the parish. I greeted the family lawyer, Ferry, who had the kind of damp, lingering handshake that forced me to wash my hand afterward. I smiled prettily at each one. I drank exactly half a glass of champagne because that was what was expected of Signora Belandi at her own party. Drink little, eat less, think profusely. Remember everything. It was when I crossed the hall to greet Capo Lobiano's mother that I saw him on the other side. He was leaning against a column near the terrace door. A man I had not seen there before. Tall, dark hair, cut short with white strands too early at the temples. A black suit cut with a precision that wasn't Italian. French perhaps, or Old English. No tie, and a white shirt buttoned up to the neck without a collar button. His right hand was in his pocket, and his left hand held a glass he hadn't drunk from. He was looking straight at me. He didn't look away when I caught his eye. I looked away. I kept walking. I greeted Signora Lobiano. I smiled. I said something about the October weather. I returned to Vittorio's side without running. On the way, I asked Ferry in a low voice, like someone commenting on a dress. I asked who the tall man near the terrace column with no tie was. Ferry glanced over and then too quickly lowered his eyes. He said it was Dante Valente. I didn't blink. I asked if Valente came here today. Ferry said it was a political invitation arranged by Capo Salviati as courtesy between families. He searched for the right word and said to refuse would be indelicate. Indelicate, I repeated. Ferry added that Don Valente accepted last week. I thanked Ferry. I returned to my husband's side. I felt without needing to look that on the other side of the hall, the man at the column was still watching. It wasn't the way a capo looks at the wife of another capo. It was in a slower way, in a way that measured things. I had been looked at in many ways in 4 years of marriage, and that look was none of the ones I recognized. I made a note. 15 minutes later, the quartet stopped playing. Vittorio tapped twice on his glass with the small silver knife from the place setting. The capos turned. The wives turned, the heads hanging on conversations turned. I also turned, because that was what was expected. Friends, Vittorio said, in that public voice he used when he wanted to be heard down to the last waiter. Today my wife turns 24. Brief applause. I smiled prettily. But today is also a night of introductions, he added. He held out his hand toward the side door of the hall. He said there is someone many of you know from business, and whom I want to introduce tonight in a different way. The door opened. Camille walked in. I had seen her twice before, always from a distance. Always coming out of a restaurant where Vittorio wasn't supposed to be. She was French, with honey blonde hair pinned up in a high bun that left the nape of her neck on display. A blood-red dress, strapless with a slit up to mid-thigh, and a smile trained for cameras. Early 20s, maybe 23, maybe less. On her neck was a necklace. I recognized it before my brain processed what I was recognizing. It was the twin jewel to mine. The dark blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, identical to my ring, set on a short white gold chain. Vittorio had had it made. There was no other explanation. That design had been exclusive to the Belandi family for 4 generations, and the only person in the world authorized to commission a copy was the man now standing next to me. I didn't blink. Vittorio smiled. It was a smile I didn't recognize. The smile of a man who was actually enjoying himself for the first time in months. He held out his hand to Camille. She crossed the 3 meters between the door and him with the calm of someone who had already rehearsed the walk in the mirror. When she reached him, he pulled her by the waist, turned to the entire hall, raised his glass and spoke loud, clear and slow, so that no one in the Cosa Nostra could pretend not to have heard. This is Camille, the woman who knows how to stand by my side without embarrassing me. The hall went silent for half a second. Then, because they were capos, and capos knew what to do when a don raised a glass, everyone raised their glasses too. I raised mine too. I smiled prettily. Inside, I wasn't thinking about anything. It was the strangest thing. I had always imagined that at a moment like this, I would think a lot or cry or feel the room spin. No, the room was still. The faces were still. Time had frozen in a clean, icy, soundless place where I could only hear one thing. The slow, almost amused breathing of the man leaning against the terrace column, who from the other side of the hall was looking at me now. The way someone looks at a card being turned over on a gaming table. Vittorio kissed Camille on the cheek, not mine, hers, in front of everyone. The twin sapphire of mine glinted at the French woman's throat. I lowered the glass with the care of someone who doesn't drop anything. I pressed my hand against the inner pocket of the dress. I felt the shape of my father's pen against my thigh. I didn't take it out. I just touched it like someone confirming a key is still in place. And then I started walking. I know today that at that exact instant, many people in that hall thought I was heading for the door. I also thought for a fraction of a second of heading for the door, But the door solved nothing. The door left the ring on my finger. The door left the name Blondie on my back. The door left the twin sapphire on her neck as a prize that I hadn't handed over with my own hand. I didn't go to the door. I went to Camille. I crossed the hall under 300 eyes. It wasn't fast, it wasn't slow. It was the right pace in low-heeled shoes that didn't trip on an old Persian rug. The quartet didn't start playing again. No waiter moved. Capo Salviati lowered his glass. Capo Lobiano lowered his glass. Ferry lowered his eyes. Vittorio saw me coming and his first reaction was to smile. He thought I was coming to greet his mistress in public. He thought I was going to hug Camille. He thought it was going to be from start to finish the most perfect night of his life. I stopped a meter away from them. I looked at Camille. Her eyes were green. They looked younger, up close. There was a slight tremor at the corner of her lip that she was trying to control with her smile, and that she couldn't hide from me. I had 4 years of practice reading trembling lips in the mirror. Camille, I said with a calm that wasn't mine, but had arrived out of nowhere from the inner pocket of the dress. Welcome. She tilted her head, not knowing what to say. I raised my left hand. The 4th-generation Blondie ring caught the chandelier light and sent back a dark blue glow throughout the hall. I slipped the ring off slowly. I didn't know until that night that the gesture of removing a ring from your finger could make a sound in a crowded hall. It did. It was the loudest sound in Blondie history. I extended my hand to Camille with the ring on my fingertips. She hesitated. She looked at Vittorio. Vittorio had frozen with his glass half tilted. His eyes were open the way I had never seen them. Open like a man who understands 1 second too late that he has lost control of his own hall. Hold out your hand, Camille, I said softly. Just for her. Don't be afraid. It won't weigh more than it is already weighing. She held it out. I placed the ring in her palm. I closed her fingers around it. I kept my hand over hers for 2 more seconds exactly, so that the picture would stay in the head of every capo present. I said in a clear, slow voice, at exactly the right speed, so the most distant waiter could hear. Then keep it all, the man, the name, the shame. He is all yours. I let go of her hand. I turned not to Vittorio but to the hall. Good evening, I said to the entire hall. Thank you for the congratulations. And I walked toward the front door. I crossed the Persian rug back without tripping. Capo Salviati did not greet me. Capo Lobiano bowed his head. Capo Lobiano's mother touched her daughter-in-law's arm next to me as if trying to prevent a reaction. The daughter-in-law didn't react. No one reacted. The hall had frozen, and I was the only thing moving inside it. Behind me, I heard Vittorio's voice call my name once. Alessia, without force. Like someone who still hadn't understood that it was too late to call. I didn't turn around. I pushed open the wooden double doors. The October air hit me in the face, cold and clean, with the smell of wet cypress and stone. The villa's outer staircase descended in 3 flights to the gravel of the parking lot. I went down the first flight slowly without trembling. I went down the second. When I reached the third, that was when I felt my legs begin to understand what had just happened. I stopped halfway down the step, gripped the iron handrail, and took a deep breath. Once, twice, 3 times without crying, without losing my verticality, waiting for the rhythm of my chest to return to normal. When I lifted my head, he was at the bottom of the staircase. He was leaning against a black car, low long, with no crest. The driver's window was rolled up. He had his hands in his coat pockets, the same white shirt buttoned up to the neck, and his hair was slightly tousled by the wind off the lake. His dark eyes were attentive, in no hurry at all. He had gone out through the side door. Obviously, he had gotten there before me. He had waited. Dante Valente, I thought. Don of the Valentes, standing on the staircase where the name Blondie had just turned to dust. Signora Blondie, he said. Moretti, I corrected before thinking. I just returned the other name. He tilted his head half a centimeter. It wasn't a bow, it was curiosity, Signora Moretti. He corrected with the final vowel slightly elongated. His voice was lower than the light of the hall had suggested. He asked who was taking me back to Milan. I hadn't thought about that. He said he could offer me a ride. It wasn't a question. It was formal courtesy spoken with the precision of someone who had calculated the sentence. I looked at him from the top of my step, and he looked at me from the top of his calm. For 2 seconds I measured the distance between the staircase and the parking lot, and between the parking lot and the gravel. Between the gravel and any other car at that party that could take me out of there without me having to step into his car. There was no other car, there was no coincidence. I knew that already. But I also knew, and that was the newest part of me born 5 minutes earlier, that accepting a ride from a rival Dawn was not a greater mistake than standing on the staircase waiting for my husband. I went down the 3rd flight. I stopped a meter away from him, close enough to smell his coat. Good wool. a faint residue of some dry cologne that wasn't sweet. I looked into his eyes. They were eyes that measured. They weren't gray eyes like Victorio's, they were almost black. "Don Valente," I said with a voice firmer than I had expected. Why was the Don waiting for me down here? He didn't look away. He answered slowly that he saw me cross the hall, and understood where I would end up. I asked if he meant here, and if he decided to be here first. He said he decided. His honesty disarmed me for half a second. That half second was enough for me to understand that he had calculated the honesty for exactly that purpose. "Don Valente," I said, and this time I let out something that resembled my voice from before 20, the voice of the girl who touched books before opening them. I told him if I am going to be used again tonight, I would rather know by whom. He held back his laugh. I saw it. It was quick. It was the kind of short laugh that men like him let out maybe 3 times a year in private. "Signora Moretti," he said, and opened the back door of the car with his free hand. He told me that for tonight what he could promise is that no one was going to use him to get to me. I told him that did not answer my question. He agreed it didn't. I looked inside the car, dark leather. No driver behind the wheel yet. The key was in the ignition. The dashboard was off. It was the car of a man who drove his own car when he wanted to talk privately. Behind me up there, the door of the villa opened. I heard Victorio's voice from the second flight of the staircase, now with force, shouting my name again. And this time, it wasn't the man who still hadn't understood. It was the man who had understood too much and too late. I got in the car. Dante closed the door with the care of someone closing a vault. He walked around. He sat at the wheel. He turned the key. The engine purred low and the car shifted into first, sliding slowly across the gravel. In the side mirror, I saw Victorio reaching the bottom of the staircase. I saw his party suit rumpled at the chest. I saw his hand raised in the air like someone still calling. I saw the ring from my hand, which was now in Camille's hand, which was now not in the hall, because Camille had stayed up there standing still. The car drove out through the gate. Dante didn't speak on the first curve, nor on the second. He accelerated on the side road that hugged the lake without hurry, with the confidence of someone who knew the curve without looking. I looked at him from the side. Firm jaw, eyes on the road. A thin scar, almost invisible, that ran from the corner of his left temple to nearly his ear. I hadn't seen it in the hall. I saw it now because I was meant to see it now. "Don Valente," I said softly. "Dante." "Don Valente," I repeated, because I wasn't going to step into his first name on the same night I had stepped out of my husband's name. I asked where we were going. He didn't take his eyes off the road. He said we were going to a place where no one would enter without my permission until I decided my next step. I asked what would happen if I decided to go back to Milan. He said he would take me tonight. I asked tonight? I looked ahead. The road climbed, curved, descended. From the height to the right, the Lake of Como opened the night in a black bottomless mirror. I pressed my hand against the inner pocket of the dress. I felt my father's pen against my thigh. I thought of him for the first time in hours, and I thought of him in the wrong way. I wondered if he would have understood what I had just done. I thought yes, and I thought he would have approved. And I also thought that maybe he would have understood better than I did the kind of man who was driving now beside me in silence. Calculating things I didn't yet know were being calculated. Dante shifted gears. The engine dropped in tone. "Signora Moretti," he said without looking at me, "tonight you ended something. I need you to know that I know that." I asked if he had started something. The question came out before I could moderate it. He looked at me for half a second. He turned his eyes back to the road. "Perhaps," he answered. I told him perhaps isn't an answer. He said it was the only one he could give right now. I didn't respond. I closed my eyes for an instant, rested my temple against the cold glass of the door, and let the lake pass outside in a bottomless mirror somewhere behind us. In a hall of the villa in Como, Camille must have still been there, with her hand closed around my ring. Victorio must have been shouting my name to empty gravel. The entire Cosa Nostra must already have been exchanging glances through the Venetian mirrors, calculating in silence which Dawn had just lost more. The details still escaped me, but the essential was clear. I had gotten into that car without being pushed, and that was for the first time in 4 years, different from anything else that had happened to me since I was 15. The car accelerated, the road curved. Far ahead, at some invisible point in front of us, an isolated light from some villa shone for a second and went out. I didn't know it was his villa. Not yet. The car glided down a narrow road that descended in curves toward Lake Como. I saw the black water reflecting the scattered lights of the villas. I felt the cold leather of the seat beneath my palms. Dante drove in silence with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting on the gear shift. I watched the line of his jaw in the dashboard light without him noticing. We had already passed through the sleeping town some 10 minutes earlier. The digital clock in the car read almost 1 in the morning. He said we were almost there. I asked almost where and for what exactly. He said it was for me to decide whether I wanted to sleep, or whether I would rather start with the bad part. I found it funny inside. On the outside, I kept my posture. I told him to start with the bad part, and I would sleep later. He turned his face for a second, just long enough for me to notice. He smiled, not with his mouth, only with the corner of his eye. He turned his attention back to the next curve. We passed through a tall iron gate that opened before the car reached it. A gravel path climbed between cypress trees up to a facade of pale stone. 3 stories, windows lit only on the ground floor. They seemed to have been waiting for hours, although no one could know he would return with a woman. Villa Valente, he said. He told me I would not be locked in. I would be protected, and to make the distinction in my head before I got out. I told him I already had. He parked in front of the main door. A tall, thin man in a dark jacket with a faint ironic smile on his lips opened the car door on my side. Tommaso, Dante said without turning. Signora Moretti is going to stay. Tommaso extended his hand to help me out. The grip was firm and short. Signora, Tommaso said, the house is not used to a female voice. It will get used to it. I climbed the 3 stone steps next to Dante. The air inside the villa was dry, smelling of furniture wax and something of cold tobacco. A low chandelier lit the foyer. There was a marble staircase to the right, a long corridor to the left, and at the end, the half-open door of a room where yellow light escaped. I noticed everything in 3 seconds. My father's pen weighed in the pocket of the dress as if it were a stone. Dante led me first to the sitting room. He took off his jacket, hung it on the back of a chair. The white shirt had a smudge of cream from my blush on the shoulder. I hadn't even seen when I had touched him. I noticed without commenting. He told me to sit. I replied that I prefer to listen standing. He rested his hand on the arm of an armchair and chose not to insist. He began by saying the proposal was simple. I could stay here as long as necessary. In exchange, I would testify against Vittorio in the circles that matter, not in court. At the dinners where Cosa Nostra decisions are made, I would say what I saw, what I heard, what he said near me thinking I didn't understand. In exchange, he guaranteed Vittorio would not come near the door of this villa. I asked if he was offering me protection in exchange for information. He said he was. I asked if he thought that put me at a disadvantage. He said he didn't think anything. He was just telling me what he had to offer. I looked at him for a long time. He held the look without blinking. I crossed my arms and felt the cold satin of the dress against my skin. I told him I also have conditions. A room with a key. I keep the key. No one comes in without knocking. No armed men inside this house while I am here. If he wanted security, keep it from the gate outward. And access to the documents about Vittorio. All of them. The ones from 5 years ago too. I wanted to read before opening my mouth at any dinner. He tilted his head. I saw his jaw lock and relax. He said documents from 5 years ago don't leave his office. I told him then I would read in his office. He said I was asking permission to sit in his chair. I said I was asking permission not to be used blindly. If that was too much, I would go back to the car. Tommaso takes me to Florence. I disappear on my own, and he deals with Vittorio without a witness. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Tommaso, standing at the door, was pretending to examine his watch. Dante finally said he accepted. Room with a key. I read in his office. No weapons inside the house. I said good, and felt without meaning to the tension leave my shoulders. He walked to the door and stopped at the threshold. He asked if I had any idea how much he hated negotiating with someone who knows exactly what they want. I said yes, and that it was the only reason I accepted the ride. That night he showed me the room on the 2nd floor. A window facing the lake, a 4-poster bed, and a heavy bronze key that he placed in my palm, without letting his finger touch my skin. He locked the door from the outside on the inside, so that I would hear the click and know without doubt that the key worked only from my side. I stayed half an hour staring at the ceiling before I got up to take off the dress. My father's pen I placed on the nightstand. I slept with the light from the lake coming through the cracks in the curtain. On the ground floor was the west wing stone kitchen behind the dining room. A small chapel in the garden closed with a warped door. On the 2nd day, Renzo Caputo, the consigliere, appeared at the door of my room. 6 feet of severity and silence. Signora, he said, I hope the Don knows what he is doing. I answered that I hoped so too. On the 3rd day, looking for a bathroom at the end of the east corridor, I opened the wrong door and found the library. A high ceiling room, 3 windows facing the garden, and dark oak shelves from floor to ceiling. Books stacked on the floor in boxes in disorder that hurt the eyes. No one had touched the place in years. Something in me from the Florence of 20 years recognized the place. I closed the door behind me and began organizing. It was on a Wednesday night that I found the book. I had already mentally catalogued a third of the library. I had reached the third shelf of the west wall, behind a wooden ladder that no one should have moved in decades. Behind a thick volume of Dante. The coincidence drew a half smile from me. There was a thin book with a faded dark blue cover with faded gold letters. A children's book. I opened it. On the flyleaf, in careful rounded handwriting, someone had written, "For my son so he learns not to be afraid of the dark, Mama." I closed the book carefully. I felt something strange tighten between my ribs. Not pity, not tenderness, something more sober. His mother had died. I knew I had heard at the Billionaire dinners years ago when Vittorio mentioned the Valentes with irony. I didn't know he kept her book there, lost among 1,000 others, like someone hiding from himself. I thought about returning it to the shelf and pretending I had never seen it. I thought about putting it on the library table in a place of honor. I thought about taking it to my room. I ended up leaving it exactly where it was, behind the thick Dante. I sat on the ladder with the blue book in my hands and stayed reading the first page, while the light from the window faded. I didn't hear the door open. I heard the footsteps. I looked up. He was standing at the threshold in his shirt, without a jacket, without a tie, with his collar open. He didn't say anything. He looked at the book in my hands for one long second, and then at my face, and then again at the book. I saw his jaw lock. I saw the control return. He didn't say a word. He took half a step inside, changed his mind, and stayed at the threshold. Finally, he closed the door from the outside with a strange care, almost reverent, like someone closing the door of a child's bedroom. I remained seated on the ladder. I put the book back in the exact spot, but the note I made mentally was strategic data. His mother dead, book kept, strange care when closing the door, vulnerability exposed for 2 seconds. It was what he would give me to use against him, on a bad night if I were the kind of woman who did that. I didn't yet know what kind of woman I would be with him, but the note stayed. Tommaso told me standing next to the kitchen table, while I was cutting day-old bread for the soup I had decided to make. I was tired of the food of Dante's cook. He had heard from a Billionaire waiter. Camille had appeared at Wednesday's dinner at Vittorio's villa, wearing the 4-generation ring on her little finger. It was too small for the size of her hand, but put on display. She had drunk too much. She had laughed loudly. She had said in front of 3 capos and 2 wives that the little Italian girl had handed over the name because she never knew how to use it. I didn't ask for the gossip, I said without looking up from the knife. Tommaso answered that I did not ask. He brought it, which was an important difference. I kept cutting. I didn't say anything for a while. I finally asked about Vittorio. Tommaso said he laughed along in the first hour. In the second hour, he told her to shut her mouth in front of Lobiano. In the third hour, he took her outside by the elbow. Tommaso paused. He said Lobiano saw it. A capo seeing the Don treat his mistress like a servant in front of him. That was news. I put down the knife. I leaned my hips against the counter. I told him to keep bringing the gossip to please. I imagined, he said, and left. I stayed alone in the kitchen with the smell of old bread and thought. Camille with the small ring on her little finger. Vittorio discharging the size of his own humiliation onto the woman he had chosen to humiliate the first. Lobiano watching everything from afar, calculating how much the Bellandis were still worth. I didn't pity Camille. Not yet. But I saw with cold clarity that she was already a disposable tool of a man who discarded by habit, and that this in some future meetings at some future dinner could be useful to me. I went back to cutting the bread. On Wednesday night, I couldn't sleep. I went back to the library at 3 a.m. with a coat over my nightgown and spread on the central table 3 maps that I had found in the bottom drawer of the desk. Maps of ports in northern Italy, Genoa, Trieste, La Spezia. Pencil markings on routes I recognized, because I had heard Vittorio speak of them for 4 years behind doors he thought were too thick. I was holding the pencil in my hand, making a cross at a point on the coast between Genoa and Savona, when I heard the door open. I looked up. Dante was standing there in a white short-sleeved t-shirt, dark pajama pants, barefoot, his hair slightly tousled. In his right hand was a bottle of red wine without a label and a glass. A second glass he held by the stem along with the first. He didn't say a word for a second. He finally said he couldn't sleep. He saw light under the door when he went down to the kitchen, and grabbed another glass on the way. I looked at the maps. I looked at him. I didn't close anything. I didn't hide anything. He noted it was 3 a.m. and asked if it was insomnia or work. I said it was both. He came in, closed the door behind him. He set the bottle and the glasses down on the free end of the table, away from the maps, careful not to drip on the papers. He asked if he could sit. I nodded and felt without meaning to my heartbeat 2 points higher than it should. He pulled out a high-back chair and sat down across from me on the other side of the central table. He poured the wine into both glasses without asking if I wanted any. He pushed one in my direction across the dark wood varnish. He observed that I marked the ports like someone drawing. I said, "That is what I do." He said, "Restorer," more to himself. I said it was supposed to be. I picked up the glass. The wine was dark and dense, smelling of black cherry. He waited for me to speak in my own time. "Genoa," I said finally, pointing with the end of the pencil. "The route Vittorio uses for the cargo he calls olive oil. It leaves from here," I marked the point, "comes around and unloads there at a private wharf. Capo Tantino is the one who runs it. The documents go out in the name of a cooperative of producers that doesn't exist." Dante rested his elbows on the table. He didn't interrupt me. "Trieste," I continued. "Different there. It is Capo Ferri. But Ferri owes a debt to Salviati, and Salviati is the man who put your name on the guest list for the party. So in practice, Ferri is half yours." He tilted his head slightly. He asked how I knew that. I said, "Vittorio speaks loudly when he drinks, and I don't close the library door when he has guests." He never suspected. He called me decorative for 4 years. Decorative doesn't listen. I listened. The corner of his mouth moved. It didn't quite become a smile. He told me to show him La Spezia. I turned the map across to him, but it was upside down from his angle. He stood up, came around the table, and stopped beside me, leaning over the paper. His arm touched mine. A small touch of his white t-shirt against the sleeve of the robe. Neither of us moved. I felt the warmth coming through the fabric. "Here," I said after a second that was too long. My voice came out lower than it should have. "It is a small anchorage. Vittorio uses it twice a month, not for drugs, for money." "Whose money?" he asked. "His in suitcases," I answered, leaving the country by sea to Tunisia and coming back washed by 2 banks in Lugano. "Bank passwords." I looked at him. He was leaning close enough for me to see up close the thin scar near his left temple, which I had never noticed so closely. I told him I do not give passwords for free. He said he was not asking for free. I replied that I was not offering yet. He let out a short breath through his nose like someone laughing on the inside. He went back to his side of the table and sat down again. He drank from the wine. I drew another cross at La Spezia, still feeling the exact spot of his arm on mine. We talked about routes until 4:30 in the morning. For the first time in 4 years, a man listened to me speak of merchandise trafficking as if I were the source, and not the wife who had cracked open the right door at the right time. I interpreted that as strategy. He was using me because I was useful, and I was useful because I had decided to be. It was exactly what I had accepted in the car on the way to the villa. It was the agreement. I didn't notice at the time the small tremor in his hand when he refilled my glass, and the wine spilled over the rim. On Friday it rained all day. Heavy rain. The kind of October rain in the north that beat on the roof tiles with the sound of a small drum. I spent the afternoon in the library at nightfall. I went down to the kitchen because I had smelled smoke through the corridor and grew suspicious. Dante was facing the stove with a dishcloth hanging on his shoulder. He was stirring with a wooden spoon the contents of a frying pan that was spitting black smoke up to the ceiling. There were broken eggs on the counter, shells and all, an open bottle of wine, a half onion, and a piece of butter melting on a saucer outside the refrigerator. He saw me arrive at the door and didn't turn. Before I could say anything, he said the cook's dinner was ready, and that what he was making was something else. I asked what it was. He said it was supposed to be risotto. I told him to stop right there. I crossed my arms at the doorway. I looked at the smoke rise and form a gray layer beneath the light fixture. I looked at the melted butter running across the marble. I looked at the wooden spoon coming out of the pan with what seemed to be a black and hard mass, and I couldn't help myself. I started laughing. I started low with my shoulders shaking, then loud, then uncontrolled, without dignity, with my hand on the doorframe so I wouldn't fall. It was a belly laugh that I didn't calculate on the spot with the cold part of my head that never slept for maybe 6 years. He turned off the heat, set down the spoon and turned to me slowly with an expression I couldn't decipher. He noticed I was laughing. I said I was. He admitted he burned the risotto and the pan. He looked at the pan. He looked at me, and then he smiled. A small smile, but a whole one with no calculation, no mask. It was the first time in 3 weeks that I had seen him do that. I stopped laughing suddenly like someone caught at something. He apologized for the mess. I told him I was not going to eat that. He said then I was going to eat bread and butter beside him. I said maybe. Tommaso appeared at the kitchen door. He looked at the smoke-filled ceiling, at the smile still on my lips, at Dante with the dishcloth on his shoulder. Tommaso said the Don had burned dinner again, and suggested I pretend it was good. Dante answered that it wasn't for me. Tommaso added that was even worse. It was at that moment that we heard the cars. 3 pairs of headlights climbing the gravel drive in the rain. Dante's face hardened in a second. He looked at me calculatingly. He said Caputo was bringing capos for an unannounced meeting. He told me to go to the library while he cleared the smoke. I answered that I was going to the sitting room. Alessia, I said, if I am a piece in this house, they are going to have to learn the board. If I am not, it doesn't matter. He looked at me for half a second, took the cloth off his shoulder, threw it on the counter, and walked out down the corridor without another word. I followed him after going up to the room quickly, changing the cardigan for a black high-necked blouse, and letting my hair down. I didn't touch the makeup. I came back barefoot through the cold corridor. At the entrance of the formal dining room, I stopped. Renzo was already there, standing beside the door, talking quietly with 2 men I recognized only by their backs. Bianchi, a veteran Valente capo, and Conte, the other younger. Dante was standing by the fireplace. He saw me arrive at the door. He didn't say anything. He crossed the room in 4 steps, took off his own jacket, and placed it on my shoulders without touching my skin. The weight of the fabric was dense, smelling of his perfume and a faint trace of smoke from the kitchen. Then, with one of my hands tucked inside the curve of his arm, he turned me to face the men. He announced that Signora Moretti, not Belandi, not anyone's wife, would be sitting with them. Renzo took half a second longer than usual to give a short nod with his head. Renzo said, Don, with respect, a woman at the table in a meeting of this nature is unusual. Bianchi looked at the floor, but his locked jaw said he agreed with Renzo. Conte tried to smile with professional courtesy without success. Dante stared at Renzo for a short time before answering. Dante answered that Signora Moretti sits. Whoever didn't want to listen could leave before the wine. No one left. Dante pulled out the chair to the right of the head of the table for me, and waited for me to sit before sitting. I interpreted the jacket on my shoulders as political care, a demonstration that I was no wife of any enemy, but someone under the arm of the Volantes, and that whoever touched me touched him. Strategy. It was strategy. It was. But something cracked a little inside when he introduced me by my father's surname. I kept my face neutral. I poured water for myself without waiting to be served. Tommaso passed behind my chair and murmured softly that the Don had never wanted wine with anyone before, so the wine had better be good. I didn't answer, but I made a note. The meeting lasted 2 hours. I spoke little. I listened a lot. Renzo presented the picture for the north, which Cosa Nostra capos were moving, which were still waiting to see, which Vittorio considered to be in his pocket. Dante asked short, dry questions without looking at me. Bianchi mentioned Lobiano with a caution that said everything. Conte at the end asked quietly what we would do about the party in Como, whether it was going to be ignored or used. That was my cue. I brought up Capo Salviati. I said Vittorio thinks Salviati loves him, but Salviati doesn't love Vittorio. Salviati loves the small anchorage in La Spezia, which Vittorio promised to transfer to the name of a cooperative controlled by Salviati in January and never transferred. Salviati also can't stand the way Vittorio talks about Sicily in front of the southern capos. I said if you go to Salviati with a real promise about La Spezia, he switches sides in one night. The room went silent. Dante asked about Lobiano without turning his face in my direction. I said Lobiano saw Vittorio push his mistress into a room by the elbow last week. It wasn't the violence, it was the indifference. Lobiano lost his brother last year in circumstances that still pain him. He can't hear indifference about a woman without wanting to kill someone. I told them not to quote me to him, but if they go to Lobiano asking how Belandi treated his own women, he will give them 2 hours. Renzo looked up at me for the first time without hardness. Renzo asked where I learned to speak like that. I answered that I learned it in 4 years of dinners, listening to men who didn't imagine I was learning. Dante didn't comment. He ended the meeting 10 minutes later. The capos left for the cars in the rain. When the door of the room closed, he turned to me. I was still wearing his jacket on my shoulders. The look in his eye held no player's calculation. It had something I didn't know how to read at the moment, but that seemed to me in the dark by the low light of the fireplace like relief. He said that was 2 capos away from Vittorio in 1 week. I agreed. He asked why I gave him that information now. I thought about the answer. I said it was because I didn't want to be used. I wanted to play. He nodded once slowly. He said nothing more. He didn't thank me. I preferred it that way. Gratitude at that moment would have ruined everything. I left the room with his jacket still on my shoulder. I only remembered to return it the next morning, folded on top of the library armchair after breakfast. He found it. He said nothing about that either. Saturday morning I woke up late. It rained the entire night. The lake seen from the window of my room had the color of molten lead. I went down to the kitchen, and Tommaso was standing at the counter with a phone to his ear, and his face closed in a way I had never seen. He saw me arrive, he hung up, he said the Don was coming and that I would want to hear it from him, not from Tommaso. I asked what happened. He hesitated. Finally he breathed. He said our informant inside the Belandus warned us in the early hours of this morning. There is a man of theirs, Bevilacqua, whom Vittorio has started to suspect. This morning, Bevilacqua's wife was found dead in front of the house in Monza. A note was pinned in her pocket. The address of this villa was written by hand, with my name underneath. It was Vittorio sending a message to Bevilacqua and to me at the same time. The kitchen went silent. The cold of the marble climbed up my bare feet. Vittorio knows where I am. Vittorio had a message sent to let you know he knows, which is different. I looked at Tommaso and then at the service door where Dante's footsteps were already approaching. Vittorio knew where I was. Vittorio hadn't sent a warning. He had sent preparation, and the warning was just the part I was supposed to see. Sunday had dawned gray, but it wasn't the light that woke me. It was the wrong silence of the villa, still heavy with the news from the day before. I already knew the sound of Villa Valente in the morning, the kitchen door that creaked when Tommaso came in with the bread, Renzo's short step in the stone corridor, the dry cough of one of the gate guards. That Saturday, the bread was missing. Renzo was missing. Anything that resembled a morning that knew what it was going to be was missing. I went down in my robe to the kitchen barefoot on the cold tiles, and found Tommaso leaning against the counter, with the phone still to his ear and nothing in his hands. Neither the bread nor the coffee nor the dry irony, as always. When he saw me, he lowered the device slowly like someone deciding halfway through the gesture whether or not to spare me. He told me the Don asked that I not leave my room until he came down. I asked since when the Don decides where I am. He sketched a half smile without joy. Since never, and he knows it, that is why he asked me to ask. I didn't sit. I crossed the kitchen, picked up the Italian coffee maker and put it on the heat. Tommaso watched me in silence until the water began to rise. I told him to tell me about Bevilacqua's wife. He said they just confirmed the news. The details match what the Don had already said yesterday. The coffee maker whistled. I turned off the heat with a steady hand, and I was angry at the steady hand before I was even afraid of the news. Vittorio had ordered a woman killed to print my name on a piece of paper. I thought of Bevilacqua's wife without ever having seen her, and I thought of myself and of the two things being in some horrible way the same thing. I asked where Dante was. Tommaso said he was in the office with Renzo. Conte locked down in Milan, Salviati not answering. Lobiano says he is going to Como today and the Don thinks Lobiano is telling the truth. Tommaso paused. He asked if I was going to leave. I told him I was not going to leave. I was going with them. He looked at me for a second too long. He said the Don was not going to like that. I said it was not his business to like. Dante appeared at the kitchen door, dressed to go out in a dark jacket, no tie, and the kind of calm on his face he only used when he was feeling bad inside. Renzo came behind him with a folder under his arm, and the expression of someone who had argued for half an hour and had lost. Dante told Tommaso to bring the car around to the front. Tommaso walked out without saying anything. Renzo stayed. I told Dante I was going with him. He said no. I told him Vittorio wrote my name on a note over the body of an innocent woman, and that he was not going to leave me there waiting. He said that is exactly what he was going to do. He walked to the counter, stopped a step away from me and lowered his voice. Alessia, he said, it isn't Lobiano coming to Como today. It is Vittorio's vanity, and wounded vanity shoots first and aims later. I told him to then take the only person in this house who knows exactly how he shoots. Renzo behind made a small sound that could have been a laugh or a throat clearing of tiredness. Dante didn't look at him. He looked at me long enough for me to understand that he had lost the argument before he started it. He told me to stay in the back seat, not to get out of the car, and not to speak unless he asked. I told him he doesn't decide what I do, he just asks. He breathed through his nose slowly, and that was the greatest agreement he gave to anyone in that house. Please stay in the back seat, he said. I stay, I answered. I went up to change the robe for black pants, a black blouse, and low shoes. I put my father's pen in the inner pocket, as if it weighed enough to balance out the rest of the day. When I came down, Tommaso was already at the wheel. Renzo had stayed in the office with 2 phones, and Dante held the back door of the car open for me without saying a word. I got in. He got in from the other side. The road that leaves Villa Valente toward Bellagio is a ribbon of asphalt glued to the rock with the lake on one side and the mountain on the other. On normal mornings, I would have thought about the colors. That morning, I thought about the width. No shoulder, no lateral escape. No way out except forward or backward. I thought as Vittorio would have thought, and I hated myself for thinking like him with such ease. Tommaso drove fast without seeming fast. Dante had his elbow propped on the console, his chin on his closed hand, looking at the curve ahead like someone reading. Dante suddenly asked Tommaso who was in front. Tommaso said there was a gray car 5 curves away, already there when we left the villa, and behind was a motorcycle 2 curves away. Dante asked if he didn't like motorcycles. Tommaso said he didn't. The first burst came before the next curve. I heard the sound before I understood the sound. It was a dry crack, then another, then many together. The window on my side cracked in a star without breaking. Dante threw me down with the weight of his whole arm. I hit my shoulder on the carpet of the seat. He fell on top of me, and I felt his body shudder once short like someone taking a punch he hadn't expected. Dante calmly told Tommaso to get off the road now. He told me to stay down. Tommaso said there was nowhere to get off. Dante told him to make somewhere appear. The car jolted to the right, scraped against something, and came back. The shots stopped for 2 seconds, reloaded, and came back. Dante stayed on top of me, and I felt his chest rise and fall fast. And I also felt something hot wetting my blouse on the right shoulder. And I knew without needing to look that it wasn't mine. I told him he took a bullet. He said he knew. I asked where and if it was his shoulder. He told me to get off him so he could look. I said no. Then Dante yelled for Tommaso to brake hard. I heard tires. I heard metal scraping a wall. I heard his door opening. I heard more distant shots and then silence. The kind of silence that isn't silence. It is just the ear refusing to accept any more sound for a moment. Tommaso said there was a stone house 80 meters away. He said we go on foot. The motorcycle will come around through the trail. Dante sat up with effort, and I saw the stain on his jacket for the first time. It wasn't big, it was exact. It was just below the collarbone on the right side, and he held his arm on that side against his body as if he were cold. I said on your feet. He said he was on his feet. I told him he wasn't on his feet, he just thought he was. He laughed soundlessly, and it was worse than if he had moaned. We got out of the car together. Tommaso went ahead with his pistol out of the holster. I was in the middle, holding Dante's good arm. He was behind, telling Tommaso every 5 steps to walk faster. We climbed a stretch of loose stones, crossed a low fence, went around an old fig tree, and the house appeared. Small, closed, peeling shutters. The kind of place where a fisherman keeps nets in winter. Tommaso forced the door open from the side with his shoulder. We went in, he locked it, he stayed at the window. He said it would take 2 or 3 minutes. Dante answered that it was enough. I sat him in a wooden chair in the middle of the empty kitchen. I took off his jacket carefully, then the white shirt. The shirt was soaked on one entire side. And I thought without wanting to think about how much blood fits in a body before the body gives up. I asked Tommaso for a kit. He said it was under the sink, as every safe house has one. There was a kit, surgical thread, a curved needle, gauze, alcohol, an ampule of local anesthetic, and a small sealed syringe. I knew about it because in Florence before Villa Belandi, I had done 2 years of first aid with the Student Red Cross. My mother had insisted, saying that a restorer's hand also needs to know how to close what tears. The bullet had gone in and out. It was the only mercy of that day. I washed my hands in the bucket of water Tommaso brought, sterilized the needle in the flame of his lighter, broke the ampule, drew the anesthetic with the syringe, and infiltrated slowly along the edges of the wound, remembering step by step what I had learned in training. Dante took a deep breath once. He didn't make another sound. I told him to look at me. I said if he passed out, I would stitch him up while he was unconscious and curse him until morning. He said he was not going to pass out. I told him he was too pale for that line. Even so, I began. The first stitch is always the worst because it is the one that proves the skin gives way. After that, it becomes rhythm. 1, 2, 3, pull close, 1, 2, 3, pull close. My hands didn't tremble. And that scared me more than if they had trembled. It wasn't fear, it was anger. Anger has a steady hand. Tommaso went out to check the road. He came back. He went out again. He came back, and this time with the afternoon already falling said something about the gray car having gone away. I barely heard. The house smelled of stone dust, of old sea air, of an old bread forgotten somewhere. The small window let in a light that had the color of lead, and that descended in tone every hour. I closed stitch by stitch, and Dante looked at me as if I were the ceiling of the house he had just chosen so as not to die. When I finished the last suture, his eyes were already closed. He wasn't sleeping. I knew he wasn't. He was just closing his eyes so as not to force anyone else to look at him like that. Night fell behind the window without warning as it falls in northern Italy in October. Tommaso came in for the last time, saw, and went out without commenting. He went to the other room to set up 2 cots that he had found in a closet. I sat in a chair next to Dante. I cleaned blood from my arm with a damp cloth. I looked at the sleeping man. I remembered myself getting into his car 2 weeks earlier on the staircase of Como, saying that if I was going to be used again, I would rather know by whom. I thought that I had gotten into that car thinking I was going to be a piece, and that I had just stitched up the hand that would move me. I could no longer decide in that fisherman's kitchen whether I was the piece, the player, or the only thing between Victorio and the man in the chair. That was when he spoke. Alessia, softly, almost without voice, eyes still closed. Alessia. The third time was a sigh. I froze with a damp gauze in my hand. It wasn't a request. It wasn't fever delirium. It was a name spoken like someone praying in a small house, like someone checking whether the only important thing in the world was still in the room. I leaned forward. I brought my face close to his. I smelled blood and a man's soap and some expensive cologne that had survived the morning. His mouth was slightly open, dry lips, brow furrowed like a child dreaming of the dark. I got close enough to feel his breath hit my cheek. I got too close. My free hand went up to his face without me ordering it to. I touched his temple. I went down his jaw. I stopped a millimeter from his mouth. I thought that if I kissed that man now in that chair, with the stitches still fresh on his shoulder, I would never again be able to lie to myself about what he was. I pulled back. I rested my forehead for a second against his temple instead of the kiss, and I moved away slowly. He didn't open his eyes when I moved away. He didn't open them on purpose. I knew he hadn't opened them on purpose. He had whispered my name 3 times and had pretended to sleep, so as not to force me into a decision I couldn't yet make. And that perhaps was the first generous thing a man had done for me in 4 years. I stood up. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to the room where Tommaso had laid out the cots. I lay down dressed. I stared at the ceiling until the ceiling disappeared. I didn't sleep. The 2 days between the fisherman's kitchen and the dinner in Milan passed in slow motion. Dante barely appeared. He was resting his shoulder, pretending to rest. I replayed in my head dozens of times the low sound of my name spoken 3 times in that chair. And every time I replayed it, I understood better that I had pulled back, and that I had not pulled back, and that the decision not to kiss had been a form of postponed kiss. It was with that head that I opened the closet 2 days later and chose the red. It wasn't revenge against Camille. Camille no longer deserved space inside that head. It was a declaration that was older, of the 20-year-old girl who had been stuffed into a black dress for the first time. She had understood at that instant that black in that house was not mourning. It was a uniform. I no longer wore the uniform. The dress had long sleeves, a high neck, a defined waist, and no neckline. The skin it showed was the skin I decided to show. Wrists, jaw, hand without a ring. No ring at all on any hand, on any finger. That was the sentence. It was complete. Dante was waiting for me in the hall of the Valente house in Milan. He wore a discreet bandage under his jacket and still moved his right arm with the confidence of a man who had learned 2 days before that he had a shoulder. He watched me come down the stairs. He didn't say anything when I reached the last step. He just held out his good arm and I left my hand in the crook of his elbow and we went in. The capos were already at the table. Renzo at the opposite head, Bianchi, Conte, 2 men I didn't know, and 3 chairs to the right. Capo Lobiano, who had come in the car of a Bellondi less than a week earlier, was now there seated waiting. When they saw me come in, there was that short silence that only happens in rooms of men who have learned to fall silent, without showing they have fallen silent. Dante pulled out the chair to the right of his head of the table for me. Lobiano stood up half a second before the others. That didn't go unnoticed by anyone at the table, and he knew it had not gone unnoticed. I sat, Dante sat, the dinner began. Victoria wasn't there, of course, but he was in every look that tried to measure my left hand without being caught. In every too gentle question about Florence, about Villa Valente, about the weather on the lake, in every compliment Bianchi made on the red of the dress while not looking at the red of the dress. Victoria was the name that wasn't pronounced. On the second course, Lobiano leaned forward. Signora Moretti, Lobiano said. He told me he would like, with the Don's permission, to offer me a piece of information. Dante didn't take his eyes off the plate. He just tilted his head a millimeter. Lobiano continued that I offered him courtesy in Como on the night when many people did not. He said he pays his debts. He said Capo Bellondi ordered the death of Bevilacqua's wife. He wouldn't give names at this table today, but in private to the Don, someday this week he would. Renzo wrote down the sentence. Another capo from the middle of the table stood up, went to the window, stayed with his back turned for a short time, came back and sat in silence. I saw Dante see this. I saw Dante store this. The dinner continued as if the wall hadn't fallen. But the wall had fallen. At the end, Bianchi and the capo from the window came to me separately to kiss my hand. Not Dante's, mine. It was the gesture that cost Vittorio 2 more men inside the hall. Neither of them said a word about Victorio. I understood that I was learning in real time the new language one speaks when Omerta begins to turn in favor of the other side. We left around midnight. Tommaso was waiting in the car with the engine low. Dante held the door for me. Before I got in, he leaned in, not toward my ear, toward my shoulder, and paused there. He said against the fabric of the dress that I didn't have to be so beautiful tonight. I didn't answer. I got in. I closed the door. I looked ahead, and only in the rearview mirror when he got in on the other side, and Tommaso put the car in gear, did I let my mouth relax into a smile that no one at that dinner had seen. The drive back to Como was silent. The lake was black. The mountains had vanished into the dark. When we passed the midpoint of the trip, Tommaso looked in the rearview mirror and said the sky had closed, and we were going to hit a storm before the villa. Dante answered that it was good. I understood in my corner of the seat, without him knowing, that it was good for him that it was raining, and that it was good for me that it was raining. Between the storm and the villa, there was no longer any room to pretend on both sides that that car was not going in the direction it had been going since the night of the ring in Como. The storm arrived before we did. When the car stopped at the entrance of Villa Valente, the rain was already falling in whole sheets. The wind pushed the water diagonally against the stone facade. Tommaso got out first with a large umbrella and opened it for me. I held it by the handle without needing anyone's arm. Dante waited for the door on the other side, refused the second umbrella with a gesture, and crossed the 5 meters to the drenched portico. He didn't seem to mind. Inside the house, the low light of the hall made the fabric of the red dress look darker. I took off my shoes, held them by the straps in one hand, let my hair fall any which way. Tommaso said he was going to the annex and asked if I needed anything before that. I said no. He asked about the Don. I said no. Tommaso nodded once, made that discreet half bow of his, and disappeared down the service corridor. The door closed. The house became ours. I didn't go up to the room. I crossed the sitting room, opened the French doors of the side veranda, and stepped out into the rain. I needed the noise. I needed the noise of the water on the stones of the veranda, the noise of the lake beating below, and a noise that wasn't my own head. The last 2 days had been too loud inside. I walked to the stone parapet. The water ran down my nape, ran down the inside of the high collar of the dress, down my back. I wasn't shivering. 4 years of Victorio had taught me not to shiver for anything. I would unlearn at some point, but not on that night. I heard the French door open behind me. I didn't turn. Dante crossed the veranda slowly, in no hurry at all, and stopped a meter to my left. He carried his own dark coat hanging from his arm. He stood there with it for a second before offering it. He told me I was going to catch pneumonia. It was the first time he called me by name with his eyes open. Standing in the light without the disguise of the fisherman's chair, I made an inner note before answering. I told him I didn't want the coat. I turned to him and said I wanted him to answer me one thing. He lowered his arm. He waited. The rain was hitting the side of his face, and he wasn't quite blinking. The bandage on his shoulder barely showed under the wet shirt. He had that look of a man who didn't yet know he was being looked at, as if he were being decided. I asked him why me. The question came out without trembling. I had already rehearsed it in the scenes of the fisherman's house, in the back seat of the car to Milan. On the staircase I hadn't gone up. He stared at the lake for 2 seconds. Then he stared at me. He slowly answered that he came to fetch me, thinking he had found a peace. But he found the only person who doesn't let herself be moved. The rain washed away some of the sound of the sentence. It didn't wash away the rest. I swallowed. I dropped the shoes on the stone floor. They fell with a muffled sound. I asked if he was lying. He said not in that sentence, but in some. He said yes, and one day he would owe me the whole list. It was this sentence that decided. Not the first, the second, because the first was the sentence that a Don knows how to choose at the right moment. The second was the first thing that hadn't been chosen. He took half a step. He waited. I didn't pull back. He took the whole step. He waited again. I didn't pull back. He slowly raised his hand and stopped 2 fingers from my face, with his palm turned toward me like someone showing he had no weapon. It was the gesture of a man who had learned in a fisherman's kitchen chair that it isn't enough to whisper a name 3 times. You have to wait for the woman to decide if she wants to be called. I pressed my cheek against the palm of his hand. His hand was cold from the rain and warm inside. The kiss took a long time to start. When it started, it was slow. It wasn't mafia, it wasn't Don. It wasn't the rush of a man who had gotten what he wanted. It was mouth on mouth, like someone answering a question that had taken years to be asked. The rain kept falling. I placed my other hand on his chest below the collarbone on the good side, and I felt his heart beat too fast for a man who seemed so still. When I pulled back enough to look, I let my hand rise to his face. I told him if he used me, I would destroy him, and that Lobiano knew how. He held my wrist with his hand, not to take the hand off his face, to keep it there. I know, he answered. We went in together. The French door slammed shut by itself behind the wind. The veranda light went out. I woke up before he did. The light on Lake Como on the morning after the storm is a different light. Low, golden, washed clean, as if someone had opened the whole house during the night and let the air change. I lay still under the sheet for a short time, counted his regular breathing beside me, counted to 10, counted to 20, and I couldn't tell myself it had been a mistake. I got up. I picked up his white shirt from the back of the armchair, the same shirt he had been wearing before the rain. It was now dry. I put it on over nothing. The buttons were large. I closed only 2. I went downstairs barefoot. The corridor was silent. Down below, a coffee maker was whistling. I stopped at the kitchen door before he noticed me. Dante was standing with his back to me, barefoot, white t-shirt, the bandage showing under the sleeve. He had set the table for 2 without asking. Bread, cheese, honey, a cut fruit that he had probably cut badly. He was fussing with the cups with the disproportionate concentration of someone doing a small thing for fear of doing a big thing wrong. Why did he show up so quickly at that party in Como? The thought crossed without ceremony. I let it spin around once and pushed it away. Not with a lie, with a choice. I knew it was a question. I knew it would still have to be asked. But I also knew that I had chosen to come down those stairs barefoot and put on his shirt, and that a real choice opens a line of credit in the morning. He turned, he saw me. He smiled a small, slightly crooked smile that I had never seen on that face. He noticed I woke up early. I noticed he made coffee. I crossed the kitchen barefoot. He pulled out the chair for me. I sat. He set the full cup near my elbow, stood beside me for half a second longer than necessary, and went back to cut the bread. Before sitting down, he stopped, looked at his shirt on me, and asked if I was keeping the shirt. I smiled and said I was keeping everything. He understood. He sat outside. The lake was smooth again, as if it had never rained the night before. I thought Dante Valente had been my salvation. After 4 years of being humiliated, he was the first man who touched me as if I were more than a broken piece. 3 months in his bed, 3 months wearing his shirt, 3 months believing that his hand on my waist was protection. I trusted until the afternoon. I walked into his office to leave a surprise and found what I should never have seen. There were receipts, photographs, and a detail connected to the woman who destroyed my marriage. It was a 2-year plan with my name at the center. Arrows pointing to Camille, to the jeweler, to the party in Como, and a sentence written by hand that still burns behind my eyes. If pushed onto the right stage, she will destroy herself. What did they mean by that? My stomach turned before I even finished reading because everything pointed to one single truth. Dante had not healed my wound. He had only chosen where to open the next one.